Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. Here it's about 8:01, so I think we're going to go ahead and get started here. Dan Casey, if you're joining us this morning, I know you have a few preliminary comments that you'd like to make before we get rolling.
Yeah, good morning. This is Dan Casey. I hope you can hear me well. And we, on behalf of Lynn, Buck Gilcrease, and myself, we appreciate you being here. There's a lot of material to cover today: school finance updates, federal funds, truth in taxation, teacher incentive allotment, and the state budget outlook, which has taken some really sharp turns, and we hope for a quick recovery. But with us today is Catherine Knepp, Josh Haney, Joe Wisnowski, Monica Zadrowski, and I'm always bumbling Monica's last name, but is also going to have some issues for you related to accountability, some spillover to this. So with that, I'll turn it back to Catherine. Thank you very much.
Yes, good morning, everyone. So just a couple of housekeeping things before we get started with the rest of the outline. Just as a reminder, we do have a chat feature where you can drop your questions as they occur to you. We won't be answering the questions as we go. We'll stop periodically throughout some of the sections to answer those questions. And then if we have time at the end, we can have a little bit longer discussion. Also, those of you who are signed up for an office hour later today, remember to check your email for the email link for that session and make sure that you've got the time marked for those sessions, since they're different going throughout the day. And then also here, you'll notice a little different thing happening with our webinar. Of course, we have our typical categories. Today we have state funding and federal funding updates, but then we're also going to have a third, what we like to call choose your own adventure option between property tax compression, compensatory education, and teacher incentive allotment. So as we progress through the end of this presentation, we'll actually run a poll so you guys can help dictate where we should go depending on which topic you have more interest in. So anyway, with that, I'll go ahead and get started with the state funding update. So as we know from the commissioner's calls from the last several weeks, that several different adjustments are being made to your ADA. First is the historical ratio from the 2018-2019 school year that's being applied to the first 4 6 weeks of this year in order to try to estimate what your ADA might have been had COVID not kept you from being able to have normal school and typical attendance taking patterns. So we'll go through each of these steps. And then the last one, of course, is applying the ESSER fund reduction to the 2019-20 school year. As we'll go through in the federal funding section, ESSER funding is supplanting some of your FSP funding. This is not new money. So let's go ahead and go through the steps. So the first one here is an estimation of the historical ratio based upon the 2018-19 school year. So we have an illustration here you've probably seen us do before, where you have counts from last year of each 6 weeks. You have the average over all of those 6 periods. And then you have the average of the first 4 periods to create this ratio. So you'll see there that you've got 0.982 is what's going to be applied to this second set of numbers. So you have 2019-20 ADA average over the first 4 attendance periods is about 26,000, and you'll multiply that by the ratio of what your 4 6 weeks last year was to the 6 weeks, that 0.982 number, and then you'll get your COVID-19 adjusted ADA. And just as a reminder, I know your calendars may have been set up differently at the start of the school year, but TEA has asked that your 4th period in this past 2019-20 school year needs to end on the last day before the closure. I know that some of that was new as we saw the schools get shut down for the remainder of the year. So just a reminder there. This adjustment factor will be applied to all other 2019-20 ADA and FTE counts. So this is not just going to apply to your regular program students. And many of you may notice that very likely will not adjust your subpopulations in a way that seems like the same type of pattern. Many of you have special education students that are continue to be identified through the end of the year. So those typically swing upward where probably this ADA adjustment will take it down. So you may see a little bit loss of estimated funding there. And then also we've asked TEA questions about this. For those of you who have populations of migrant students, those will also be subject to this adjustment. So even though you typically don't use those six weeks in the 2018-19 school year, you might have to do a little different methodology to come up with this historical ratio than what feels comfortable. So it's being applied even with those districts in the same way. And then in terms of how this will be accounted for in cash flow, TEA State Funding Division says that the summary of finance will reflect this adjustment at near final settle up. So if you aren't seeing that yet, that's why. And then here's the last step, of course. Those of you who may be perplexed by this, it is a little bit odd the way that they're choosing to put in the money this time as opposed to handing it out at the beginning of the year. They're making this adjustment this way. So you have the ESSER CARES Act grant, right? You have that total from the PDF online that shows what your district is entitled to. And then you're gonna subtract from that 5% for that private nonprofit equitable services provision that you're required to have for those schools. And then TEA will calculate the ADA loss that equals that remaining total. So whatever that ends up being, whether it's 10 ADA or 20 ADA or 2 ADA, it'll vary based upon your school district. Now, just as a reminder, that 5% reduction only applies to typical ISDs, and charters are not subject to that same requirement. So you'll skip that middle step if you're a charter school. And then here's that last reduction. So you'll have FSP M&O ADA, and then you'll have FSP INS ADA that will be just slightly different because of that adjustment. Now, just a couple of little details about this, because we know that not all schools are impacted the same way in terms of state aid. So the adjustment will impact refined ADA and then also subsequently WADA. So think about that in terms of the ripple effect through the other tiers of funding. It will not impact other ADA FTE counts used to determine tier 1 entitlement. So that's a little bit of adjustment on that section. And then ESSER ADA adjustment will occur whether or not your district applies for the grant, because we were thinking to ourselves, well, what if we just didn't want to apply for this grant, especially if it wasn't a meaningful amount of money? I know there's some paperwork attached to this, but TA assures us that they will apply it whether or not you go through the process. So probably should just go through the process. More info on this can be found at TA's new state funding FAQ document. And this should be clickable. So if you have questions, you can go there. Reminders that there are 2 different documents. There's a general state funding FAQ document, and then there's the CARES Act funding document. And those 2 really do work together. So if you're not seeing a piece of information you expect to see on one, go look at the other one because it's likely there. And then in terms of adjustments for next year, I know we're all wondering about this, especially as we're establishing our budget and tax rates for next year here at the start of the summer. TA has not yet announced what kinds of adjustments will be in place for 2021 school year. If we're reading the tea leaves correctly, we think that it's unlikely that TEA will fund 2021 based on an historical trend and an attempt to sort of hold you a little bit harmless. Which, you know, remains to be seen how attendance will be taken for remote learners, because many of you are planning for virtual learning to continue with some or all of your students, or even providing that option freely to some families that feel like that's the best route for them. So it's unclear how that will happen, whether attendance will be taken in the same manner that virtual schools have, which is through completion, or whether there'll be some adjustment to the way that typical attendance taking patterns occur. It's hard to tell. The commissioner continues to promise that to us, but we just haven't seen it yet. So we also don't know if schools will be held harmless if there's another shutdown, but we think given the amount of stress that the commissioner has placed on having intersessional periods and adjusting for time lost, that it seems to be the expectation that schools will need to make up for any lost time, that we won't just simply be in crisis reaction mode in the same way that we were this spring. So I think the best advice might be to be prepared. So then good news though is for those of you who are thinking about adding some time to your calendar, especially to address some of the gaps that we see occurring with those students who were not able to engage in the same way that they would at school. The commissioner urged school districts to consider amending your calendar for the next school year. And House Bill 3 does provide some additional funding should you choose to add some days to your calendar. That's only half-day formula funding for up to 30 additional instructional days. And that's a reminder that that begins September 1st. So you can't just simply start in July and think that you're going to accrue some of that half-day formula funding for those additional instructional days. The other thing to keep in mind is that this funding is designed for your elementary schools for PK to 5th grade students. So you won't be eligible for that additional half-day formula funding for having high school kids come for additional time. And when I talk about additional time, what that really means is that you still have to fulfill the 180-day requirement. Even if you're a district innovation, you need to make sure that your calendar reflects all of those days. And you are fulfilling that 75,600 minute requirement. So the stress here is not just that your students show up on additional days, but that they're maximizing the time, the seat time that they are there. And so here you'll see that districts adopting additional days in this coming school year will not receive the extra funding until final settle up. This won't necessarily be the case coming in additional years down the road, but for this first year of implementation, this is one of the few things that was a holdover to the second year of the biennium for implementation for House Bill 3. You'll see that this little graph from TEA shows that 6 weeks of ADA attendance will be taken and reported as normally, but then you'll have the 7th 6 weeks attendance taken and reported on in August for your additional period. And then of course you'll have that settle up process where TEA will flow those funds to districts in April, May of 2022 during the final settle up for the 2021 school year. So it'll be a little bit of a delay before you see that money, but you are eligible for that additional funding. So that's good news. Now, what's really interesting and great about our Texas School Policy Network and just Moat Casey offices in general is that we have accountability department here to help us work and integrate this concept of funding and additional school days into what we know about instruction. So I'm going to let Monica Zoyeski here, who heads up our accountability group with Terry Fichot and Alicia Thomas, to talk a little bit about how that impacts instruction.
Yes, good morning, everyone. Thank you, Catherine. As she mentioned, I'm Monica Zdrojewski. I work on our accountability team. And so as many of you know, STAR was canceled for school year 1920, which puts us in what we are calling an accountability gap year, where districts and campuses across the state of Texas are categorized as not rated for school year 1920. And so what that means is that for next school year, districts and campuses will still be subject to the same interventions and sanctions that they may have been subject to previously, as there will be no academic data that the state will use from this past school year for accountability ratings purposes. And so what we wanted to share with you all today is just what we believe the impact will be of the school closures due to COVID-19. So NWEA MAP is a nationally normed assessment that's administered across the United States, where it's a proficiency or growth-based, it's a growth-based test, I'm sorry. And so it allows teachers to identify specific areas where students are at and track their growth throughout this school year. And so NWE MAP has been really providing a lot of data over the course of their administrations about the impact of the summer slide, because school districts will administer this assessment 3 times a year, in the fall, in the middle of the year, and at the end of the year. And so through their research, they actually have gone ahead and made some projections of what the school closures from COVID will result in. And so their projections suggest major academic impacts from closures for students, particularly in mathematics, as you see here. And so in mathematics, students are likely to show much smaller learning gains, returning with less than 50% of the learning gains. And in some grades, nearly a full year behind what we would observe in normal conditions. And we see that these particular dips are really pronounced in the elementary grades. And so we highlight this because we know that your academic staff is really going to be coming to the business and finance side and asking for funds to help make up for this learning loss. And so if we can advance to the next slide, we see that these, the learning loss as a result of the school closures is again even more pronounced for students that come from a low income background. But even students you see here who come from a high income background, there is projections that they are going to dip in terms of the learning gains from last academic year. And so what that's going to look like is that teachers and administrators are going to feel additional pressure to make up for those significant learning loss and gaps that we're seeing as a result of those school closures. And so as you plan for school year 2020-2021, we again wanted to highlight some of the things we believe academic staff will be really seeking. And one, technology needs. Of course, there's a lot of uncertainty as to what school year 2021 is going to look like. There may be potential short-term closures that will need to result in oscillating between a virtual format and an in-person format. And so for tech that has been distributed, is there a plan to inventory it? I think a lot of districts are projecting that they, may not get all of their technology, Chromebooks, MiFi's back, and if they do receive them back, will they be in working condition, and what the plan is there. Additionally, we have heard from districts that are interested in doing a jumpstart program. So since there was no STAR this past school year, typically that data would drive any SSI initiatives over the summer. But how are districts going to plan to identify highest need students, and how will this instruction be offered? And of course, how will that, if districts do go forward with a jumpstart program, for example, where they start 2 weeks earlier in July, how will those programs be funded? Scope and sequence, of course, assessing how much student progress was made during the past academic year to identify where those gaps may exist. And there may be adjustments that need to be made to curricular resources, which of course could result in additional expenses. Staffing, we believe that there will really need to be some strategic decisions made about how to staff. We anticipate that students will be coming back with more trauma and different needs that they may have previously had. We also anticipate that students who may not have had as many needs in the past may be coming back to school needing a lot of additional support. And so staffing will be a key consideration. Do campuses need more counselors and social workers or interventionists to help meet the needs, the academic and social needs of their students? Additionally, principal and staff training, how will PD needs be determined? And additionally, how will professional development be offered to make sure it's customized to support staff for the various contingencies that may happen? And finally, the master schedule. As Catherine mentioned, we've been hearing a lot from Commissioner Morath about considering a year-round or intersessional calendar, and there are implications that come along with schedule redesigns. Additionally, I know many districts are considering what their general master schedule will look like, whether students are coming on alternating days, and what that will look like logistically. So there are many unknowns, but many contingencies to start thinking and planning for and budgeting for. And again, with the alternative calendars, again, this is not a mandatory requirement by the commissioner, but rather a suggestion to really help build in some additional makeup time in light of potential school closures. And so TEA has announced that they're looking into flexibility for the online testing window in the fall and spring. However, Commissioner Morath did announce that they did not plan to give any additional flexibility for administration of the paper-based STAR tests. And so, of course, as you think through calendar redesign, this is something to keep in mind, that those STAR windows are not going to change unless they're able to be offered online, which are very few and far between. And he has promised a new FAQ with additional details to be released soon.
Okay, thanks so much, Monica. It's so important to think about all of the different things that go into our schools and what those are going to cost, especially as instructional needs change. And speaking of instructional needs, one of the things we couldn't provide this year as much as we did before was transportation back and forth to different places, simply because we weren't taking kids to school. However, there will be no hold harmless or adjustment for the transportation allotment. TEA explains that because you didn't have the same cost of services, that they don't need to provide the full allotment for that result. So just keep that in mind. Don't count on that typical funding that you have had in your budgets. And now I'm going to turn this over to Joe Wisnowski, because we know we want to think about next year and how this is going to impact what will be available to you.
Good morning. I'm going to talk a little bit very briefly about state budget issues. You've all probably heard that Governor Abbott and the other leadership have asked state agencies to make cuts in their budgets. The letter they asked for spending reductions with pointed to 5% cut, but it's 5% of the biennial total for agencies that were affected. That actually equates to more like an 8% cut for what's remaining of the biennium. Roughly 75% of the general revenue related budget was exempt from the cut, including the Foundation School Program and TRS contributions. Some of the other state agencies like State Health Services, Department of Public Safety, Corrections, community colleges, all were exempted from the cut. So it doesn't really amount to a tremendous amount of money, about $1.5 billion in the non-exempt services that would be cut by this action, and that's within the current biennium. Now, moving on to the next slide, we have a consistent message from TEA and state leadership that they don't plan to make any cuts in school funding for the 2021 school year. However, we're still pretty early in the assessing the economic impact of the COVID-19 shutdowns, so that's a picture that could change, like many things that are happening lately. We expect a very robust discussion of budget issues come January. We've already had a couple of folks in leadership positions stating their opinions. Move on to the next slide. Senator Nelson is chair of the Senate Finance Committee, and she's really made it very clear that she's going to start at zero and build up from there when looking at appropriation requests. Another person who's made comments related to education funding is Representative Dan Huberty, chair of House Public Education Committee, who wants to make sure that we continue with the gains made under House Bill 3. So those are two differing kind of positions staked out at this point by folks who have leadership positions in the legislature. But a lot of this will depend on how the economy shapes up. If we move on and take a look at sales tax, we are getting some worse results now that we're a little bit farther in assessing the damage of the COVID-19 shutdown. Sales tax receipts for the last month, May, were down 13.2%. That really reflects sales that occurred during April, because sales tax receipts for the state lag behind a month in terms of the payments. So that's a month where we were pretty well into things. May is a month where things are starting to open up and recover, we think. So it'll be interesting to see what happens with the June receipts. We won't see those for several weeks though. Another real worry on the horizon is severance taxes. Severance taxes were down over 75% compared to the preceding year. You'll recall at one point, the price of oil was actually negative on the spot market because there was too much in circulation. Nobody wanted any more oil. That's having a severe impact on collections for that tax. If we look at the overall picture of taxes, just about everything is running behind the projected growth. About the only thing that seems to be ahead is cigarette and tobacco taxes. I'm not sure why alcoholic beverage taxes aren't doing any better, given the worries that people have these days. But apparently mixed drink taxes can't come in when the bars aren't open. So what we've assessed so far is that we're about $1.8 billion behind in terms of what would have been collected so far. It's hard to make up that kind of shortfall in the remaining months for this year or even next. And we're not even sure that that's the full extent of the shortfall in state tax receipts. In terms of what's going to happen in the near future, in early July, as I mentioned before, we'll get the sales tax receipts that reflect the economy as of May. In mid-July, we expect the controller to revise the biennial revenue estimate to account for some of these slowdowns. And in August, we'll start seeing legislative appropriations requests from state agencies and budget hearings. Instructions on those appropriations requests haven't even actually gone out yet. So we're anxiously awaiting what the legislature and the governor's office asks state agencies to do to trim back their budgets. In terms of the impact that is expected nationwide, the COVID-19 on a comparable basis is expected to be even a deeper hit to state economies and state revenues than was the Great Recession, which was a really much more extended period of time. If you think about those negative numbers, remember that the Texas economy is in a ballpark of about 10% of the national economy. So you can see how the 2020 fiscal year is about $185 billion in reduced revenues to states. That would put Texas somewhere in the neighborhood of 18 billion, using that ballpark number. The hole isn't quite that deep yet, but it'll be interesting to see how that develops. Now, with that in mind, I'm going to turn it over to Josh to talk about some federal funding issues and talk about how that impacts school budgets.
Thank you, Joe. So I'll move kind of quickly through this. I know we are getting close to that 8:45 ending, but Catherine, if you want to go ahead and go to the next slide. So just a quick recap here. As y'all know, the CARES Act was the third of 4 stimulus packages that have been passed so far. In total, it's a $2 trillion package, and it included 3 main education packages or programs that were specific to education. Those are listed there. The Governor's Emergency Education Relief Fund. Texas got $307 million out of that. The ESSER Fund, which we are all becoming familiar with lately, Texas got $1.3 billion from that. And then the Higher Education Emergency Relief Fund, which of course is designated for higher ed. And I don't know if USD has announced Texas numbers for that yet. But the other pot of money listed there, the Coronavirus Relief Fund, also goes to cities and counties. But if you guys have been watching the commissioner calls, Commissioner Morath has announced that state leadership has made some of that available for schools, and we'll touch on that more here in the next few slides. So as y'all probably saw, TDA has published sort of the entitlement amounts for each school district. We have that here in the copy of the presentation we send out after this that will be clickable. So if you haven't seen that yet, make sure to go look that up for your district. One thing to stress is that, of course, with these ESSER funds, these are being used to essentially replace state funding, right? This is not new funding, that you should look at, to offset any new expenses. As Catherine sort of walked through earlier, they're going to reduce your ADA, your state funding ADA, and then fill that sort of hole that they dig in with this ESSER fund. You will have to apply for this, and the grant application, according to TDA, will be released sometime this month. Of course, since it's federal dollars, it's going to come with a whole host of extra reporting requirements, and some, it is pretty broad, and we'll touch on this later, what you can spend it on, but there are some spending restrictions. And then, of course, with the federal funding, it does come with the private nonprofit equitable services requirement, and that also applies to the governor's pot of money as well, that $307 million that we touched on earlier. And then just to kind of get the timeline, to see what TEA has announced about the timeline, when, what expenses are eligible. USDE has said that they'll allow pre-award costs back to March 13th. And then the funds need to be sort of spent by September 30th of 2022. And so, like I mentioned, the list of allowable costs, if you look in that CARES Act FAQ, there's 12 items listed, and they're pretty broad. And we just pulled out some examples there. Provide principals or other school leaders with resources necessary to address the needs of their individual schools. Well, that hopefully includes a lot of your expenses. Same with that next item, the unique needs of many different types of students. And then, of course, I think the last one is the 12th item listed. It's just maintain the continuity of services and employ existing staff. So that should include just about every expense in y'all's budget prior to this thing. There are some examples of unallowable costs, and specifically in the Q&A they list construction, so you can't go out and build new facilities with this, and child nutrition expenses that are reimbursable through the Texas Department of Ag. So, of course, like I mentioned, these are federal dollars that are being used to offset state funds, and with that, it comes all these extra reporting requirements and considerations. Some things to keep in mind that TA has sort of addressed in the FAQ is that if you do have staff that are split funded, then time and effort reporting is something you'll have to keep on top of. And then TA has also announced that the ESSER funds, there'll be some compliance reporting requirements and also quarterly reporting requirements with that as well. I would highly encourage everyone on the call today to sign up for TEA's trainings on how to apply and manage for the CARES Act. Those are coming up next week. The dates and times are listed there, and then that link will be clickable in the version of this presentation we send out after this. And in the interest of time, we'll kind of move on to the next pot of money. And of course, we'll answer sort of your questions in the office hours. If you have specific questions about, this expense in my district, which pot of money would be appropriate to use to pay for that, we can kind of help you sift through those questions in a more direct way during the office hours. But so the next pot of money that TA has announced is the Coronavirus Relief Fund. Again, this is part of the CARES Act. It wasn't one of those three pots of money that were specifically dedicated to schools, but state leadership has announced that around $300 million of that can be accessed for schools. There's a cap on it. The cap starts at $50,000 dollars, and then it goes up depending on your number of comp ed students. So if you have more than about 200 comp ed students, your cap will be higher than $50,000. And then it kind of works similar to FEMA in this way, that it's a 75-25 split. So if however many, the total amount of eligible costs that you submit to TEA through this thing, you'll get 75% of that reimbursed to you. They did say, Commissioner Morath did say on the call early on that they were sort of expecting around $300 million in total expenses across the state to be submitted. And if it ends up being more than that, then the 75-25% split may be reduced. And so that's just something to keep in mind. Some other things that aren't allowable in the coronavirus relief fund reimbursement are, if you can get it through FEMA, for example, you won't be able to get it reimbursed through this CRF program. The application, TEA said that they're going to try and get that open on July 20th. It's going to close on September 15th. So I'm sure everyone on the call has been tracking those costs, and you guys are all ready to go. But just make sure that once July 15th rolls around, you're ready to submit all that to TEA. I'm sorry, July 15th. Yeah. So the allowable expenditures, there is these sort of 3 requirements that are listed out in TEA's FAQ. It has to have been incurred due to the COVID-19 pandemic, something that wasn't in your most recently approved budget as of March 27th. And it had to have been incurred from March 1st through May 20th. And there's a long list. The TEA spends quite a bit of time in the FAQ describing what it means to be incurred from March 1st through May 20th. So if you do have questions about that, I think TEA does a pretty good job of explaining that in the FAQ. And of course, you can reach out to us with any questions on that. So essentially, because of those 3 requirements, this does constitute a supplement, not supplant provision. So just something to keep in mind as you're making plans on how to spend this money. So they do list some examples of allowable costs, and again, this has to be tied to the pandemic. So things like technology cost to facilitate distance learning is something that would be allowed, that you get reimbursed under this program. Payroll and benefit costs for educational support staff or faculty that are developing those online programs, or that are helping to continue sort of educational instruction during this time. Those are, again, some examples of expenditures that TEA said that would be reimbursable under this program. They have also listed some unallowable costs. So like I mentioned, costs that are reimbursable under other programs like FEMA from the Ag Department would not be allowable. Payroll costs for employees whose work duties are not substantially dedicated to mitigating or responding to the COVID-19 public health emergency. And so again, this pot of money is trying to help reimburse costs specifically tied to COVID-19. So those would not be allowable. They also list damages covered by insurance. And then they also list you can't have this program reimburse the other 25% that you don't get reimbursed through FEMA for those eligible expenses. And this is just kind of a summary to kind of show how we're thinking about these pots of money working in tandem. Sort of the FEMA program is more narrow in terms of what it will cover, just those extra cleaning and sanitization costs. The coronavirus relief fund, again, can be used for those remote learning costs and those extra technology expenditures. The cap on that is around $300 million statewide. It's based on, and then for the individual district, it's based on your number of comp ed students. And then for the ESSER funds, again, this is not new money. This is money that is just essentially the state is using to reduce its obligation under the FSP and hold you guys harmless. And then there's sort of two other things that are question marks today. The governor's money that they got through the CARES Act, that's sort of dedicated for education. Like I mentioned earlier, Texas is going to get around $307 million under that. Governors across the country have a lot of discretion on what that's used for. The Secretary DeVos has urged those governors to use those costs for remote learning. It remains to be seen how that'll be used in Texas, since they're sort of using that coronavirus relief fund for those remote learning costs. But we've reached out to the governor's office, and they just said they're not ready to release their plan yet on that. And of course, those the private nonprofit equitable service requirements would also apply to any money you receive through this program as well. And then, of course, there's another. It's likely that another phase to the federal stimulus is. Well, I guess I should say negotiations are kind of heating up between Democrats and Republicans in Congress on this fifth package. Democrats have passed one proposal out of the House, and then Republicans have initially they came out pretty hard against any additional stimulus, but now Republican leadership is starting to make more comments indicating that they're sort of open to negotiations on what that fifth package looks like. And then I think with that, we'll do a quick poll. I know we're getting close to our time here, and I think it's okay if we go over a couple minutes. And so what this is as Catherine mentioned earlier, it's a sort of choose your own adventure. I know there's a lot going on with COVID-19, but if you guys wanted us to do a refresher on any House Bill 3 topic, the poll should be up there now, and I'll give it a couple more seconds for y'all to vote. It looks like property tax compression is out with an early lead. All right, things are kind of slowing down here. I'll just give it a couple more seconds to finish up. And then, of course, if your section wasn't chosen, the slides are all available to review afterwards. And if you do have questions, feel free to reach out to us, and we'll be happy to answer them. So I'm going to go ahead and shut off the polling, and then I can share the results. Property tax compression was a clear winner. So Joe, let's go through a very quick refresher on how property tax compression is going to work.
Okay, property tax compression in 2 minutes or less. The controller's forecast has one role to play in property tax compression, and there's also a separate formula related to local property value growth that limits the amount of additional revenue that a district can get from local property taxes to a 2.5% increase compared to the prior year. There is copper penny compression, but only in years in which the basic allotment increases, so it's not going to apply next year. Let's move on to the next slide, Josh. So there's a state compression percentage that is built around the controller's forecast of growth. That's 4.01% growth statewide. That results in a compressed tax rate for Tier 1 of about 91.64 cents. Local compression becomes a factor anytime the growth exceeds 2.5%, growth in taxable value exceeds 2.5%. TEA is going to make that determination based on what they've now decided is using the net taxable values of school districts to determine that growth. You'll be asked this summer, once property values are delivered after the July 25th certification, to provide the information to TEA that they'll use to make that calculation. If we move on to the next slide, Josh, I'm trying to quickly summarize all this for you to get us finished with this particular presentation. Let's skip that one. We've already kind of talked about it. Here's TEA's request for information. The July certified values of the preceding year versus certified values for the current tax year. They have asked for additional information. We're not sure exactly what they're going to do with that, and they haven't actually shared the precise calculation that they intend to apply to school districts. But you'll be notified by August 5th of their results. after an appeal process, you can appeal it. They're going to finalize those results by August 31st. What that means is if you grow more than 4.01%, your tier 1 compressed rate is going to be less than 91.64 cents. Until you know how your certified values have grown, you can't really make that determination. And actually, TEA is going to make it for you under their rule. You probably want to delay your tax rate adoption as late as possible, but because this proposed rate appears in your notice for the budget hearing and tax rate, you probably want to delay that hearing until as late as possible in August to address whatever it is that TEA comes up with as a tax rate for you. Here's an example. We've got the 9164, which we think of as the maximum tier 1 rate that will be allowed next year based on the controller projection of value. The lowest rate can be no lower than 90% of that highest rate. So that can be no less than 82.47 cents. Here's an example of a district whose 2019 tax rate was the highest, $1.683. The tier 1 rate was 93 cents. Tier 2 level 1 is 8 cents, and the tier 2 level 2 is 5.83 cents. The maximum rate that district could have adopted is 17 cents above 93 cents, or $1.10, but no TREs were allowed in 19. For 2020, the maximum rate is going to be 17 cents above 91.64 if that district grows at less than 4.01%. If they grow more than that, the tier 1 rate is going to be less than 91.64 cents. They can retain their tier 2 pennies from the preceding year. They could access additional tax rate, but only if they have a TRE. So that's just one example of what a district can do in the next year. If they have growth higher than 4.01%, the tier 1 rate decreases, but all the tier 2 pennies are retained, and they still have 17 cents above whatever their tier 1 rate is assigned by TEA to be. Okay, the commissioner, this is a question about tax compression COVID-19. Commissioner and the controller have no authority to freeze property values, and the governor's come out against it. As far as we can tell, no districts are intentionally freezing property values. Some are probably holding some values relatively low in terms of increase. The controller is going to continue with the property value study in tax year 2020. So come January, we'll know a little bit more about where that actually ends up being. And of course, that will be used in your 2021 funding calculations once the controller makes that determination. I think that's about all the time we have left. Josh, do you want to add anything else?
I'm just scrolling through the chat right now. Looks like you guys have done a good job of sort of responding to everyone's questions. Yeah, with the Edgar stuff, the Edgar requirements, we're not sure exactly what all of that will be required with the CARES Act. But we do know that TA has sort of outlined some of those time and effort considerations in their FAQ. We can certainly reach out to the agency and try and track that down. I will say, for any other questions that we didn't get to on this, of course, we'll have the office hours like we mentioned. And then with these presentations, we also include a sort of follow-up Q&A document that on our website where we will sort of track down some of these answers and post that up for you guys, and we'll email that out to you. And so be looking for that. And again, we'll email it out to everybody so you guys can see sort of what answers we were able to get on some of those questions. I think that's all for now. We'll have to run to get set up for the accountability webinar, but thanks everyone for joining us. Again, feel free to bring some of these questions to the office hours if you're signed up, and if not, you can email us at tspn@mokecasey.com, and we're happy to chase down any information that you're struggling to get a hold of, or just any other questions, any district specific questions you may have. And yes, we will send out a copy both of the presentation and a recording of the webinar later on this afternoon. All right. Well, sorry for running out of time, guys. Maybe next time we'll we'll schedule this for maybe an hour and a half or something, a little bit longer. But thanks again, and feel free to join us over on the accountability webinar. And of course, we'll see y'all next time. Thank you.